She thought he was just a quiet old man. The HOA president ordered his historic private bridge demolished, calling it an eyesore. What she didn't know was that the bridge was federally protected, and the quiet old man was a federal judge with the power to ruin her. You won't believe the legal firestorm he unleashed. The splintering crack of century-old timber was the sound of war being declared. It echoed through the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes of the Willows at Miller's Creek, a homeowners association that valued aesthetic conformity above all else. At the source of the noise, two men with chainsaws were systematically dismantling a small, elegant wooden footbridge that arched over the creek. Directing them with the furious energy of a battlefield commander was Brenda Van Patten, president of the Willows HOA. She was a tempest of entitlement wrapped in a canary yellow peacoat that was offensively bright against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. Her face was flushed with righteous rage, a finger jabbing accusingly at the wreckage. "I don't care if it's been here since the dinosaurs," she shrieked at the small, horrified crowd of neighbors that had gathered. "It's unapproved. The wood stain is not on the pre-authorized pallet. It's an eyesore and a liability. Get it down," standing slightly apart from the crowd. On the lawn of the handsome stone house that the bridge connected to was a man in his late 60s. He had a full head of silver hair and wore a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the destruction, not with anger or panic, but with a chilling, almost academic stillness. His name was Arthur Covington, and the bridge was his, to the residents of the Willows. He was just the quiet old uncle in the stone house, a retired widower who kept to himself. They were mistaken. Arthur Covington had indeed retired, but not from a career in accounting or sales. He had retired from the bench of the United States District Court for the Western District of North Carolina. He was a federal judge, a man who had presided over complex cases involving corporate fraud, organized crime, and constitutional law, a man whose days had been spent weighing evidence, interpreting statutes, and wielding the immense power of the federal judiciary. He was watching Brenda Van Patten and her crew not as a wronged homeowner, but as a judge observing a crime in progress. The bridge was not just a bridge. It was built in 1936 by his own father, a civil engineer who had used salvaged heart pine from a local textile mill. It was a perfect example of rustic WPA-era craftsmanship. More importantly, because it crossed Miller's Creek, a designated navigable waterway, albeit a small one and was over 50 years old. It had been quietly added to the National Register of Historic Places a decade ago. It was a federally protected structure. Destroying it was not a covenant violation. It was a federal offense. Brenda, in her quest for aesthetic purity, had declared war on the bridge a month ago. She had sent Judge Covington a series of increasingly aggressive letters, citing HOA bylaws written in 2005, 50 years after his house and bridge were built. The letters demanded he submit an architectural plan for approval, repaint the bridge in an HOA-approved shade of taupe, and provide proof of a $2 million liability insurance policy. Judge Covington had replied with a single, polite, registered letter. In it, he calmly explained that his property predated the HOA's existence and was not legally subject to its covenants. He further explained that the bridge was a federally protected historic structure and that any attempt to alter or remove it would be a violation of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, punishable by severe fines and potential imprisonment. He had even included a copy of the official federal registration document. He assumed that would be the end of it. He had underestimated the spectacular arrogance of Brenda Van Patten. She had apparently seen his letter not as a legal warning, but as a challenge to her authority. Now, she stomped toward him, her face a mask of triumph. "There," she said, gesturing to the splintered remains of the bridge. "Problem solved, Mr. Covington. Now your property is finally in compliance. You'll be receiving a bill for the demolition crew, as well as a fine for the initial violation." Judge Covington slowly uncrossed his arms. He looked at the wreckage of the bridge his father had built, then back at her. His eyes were not angry, They were cold. They were the eyes he used when a lawyer tried to present a flimsy, dishonest argument in his courtroom. "Ms. Van Patten," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense, invisible weight. "Are you acting in your official capacity as president of the Willows at Millers Creek Homeowners Association?" She scoffed. "Of course I am. I am enforcing the rules that protect our property values." "I see," he said, his gaze unwavering. "And you are aware that you are on private property." "Correct, my private property." "It's about to be less private when the HOA puts a lien on it for the fines you owe," she shot back. "One final question," the judge said, his voice dropping even lower. "Did you receive my registered letter explaining the bridge's federally protected status under the National Historic Preservation Act?" "I received your little love letter, yes," she sneered. "Some nonsense about history. This is a private community, Mr. Covington, not a museum. Federal laws don't apply to our private bylaws." It was a statement of such profound, breathtaking ignorance that the judge almost felt a flicker of pity for her. She had not only confessed to the crime, but she had also confessed to the mens rea, the willful intent, the deliberate disregard for the law. She had just handed him a perfect, gilt-edged case, tied with a ribbon. He gave a single, slow nod. "Thank you, Miss Van Patten. You've been very clear." He turned his back on her, took out his phone, and walked toward his house. Brenda stared after him, convinced she had won, that she had finally put the quiet old man in his place. Judge Covington did not call the local police. He didn't call a lawyer. He sent a single text message to a number on his favorites list. It was to his former law clerk, a brilliant young woman who now worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office. The message was simple and devastating. "Catherine, please open a new file, civil and criminal. The people, Vishti, the Willows at Millers Creek HOA. Brenda Van Patten, et al. Charges to include violation of the National Historic Preservation Act, felony destruction of property, and conspiracy. Also, get me the regional director of the Army Corps of Engineers on the line. They'll want to know about the debris in the waterway." He put his phone away and stood in his living room, looking out the window at the ruin of his bridge. The war had been declared. But Brenda Van Patten had no idea she was fighting an army that had already surrounded her, an army whose general she had just met, and whose power she could not possibly comprehend. In the immediate aftermath of the demolition, Brenda Van Patten was incandescent with triumph. She saw her actions not as destruction, but as a righteous cleansing. That evening, she composed a special edition of the Willows Weekly newsletter, a document that would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case against her. "A victory for compliance and safety," the headline screamed in an aggressive, all-caps font. "Your HOA Board of Directors is pleased to announce the successful removal of the dilapidated and unapproved structure on Lot 1, she wrote. This long-neglected eyesore, which violated numerous community bylaws and posed a significant safety risk, has been professionally dismantled. This action reaffirms our board's unwavering commitment to protecting the aesthetic integrity and property values of our beautiful community. We thank you for your support." She hit send, dispatching her self-congratulatory screed to the inboxes of all 200 homeowners, a digital victory lap that sealed her fate. She went to bed that night sleeping the sound, dreamless sleep of the truly certain. But outside, in the quiet, tree-lined streets, a different sentiment was taking root. The residents who had witnessed the event had been shaken. They had seen the quiet dignity of Judge Covington and the unhinged fury of Brenda Van Patten. They had heard the splintering of the historic timbers. While many were too intimidated by Brenda to speak out, a small seed of rebellion had been planted. The next morning, a new sign appeared on the public easement near the judge's property. It was crudely painted on a piece of plywood, but its message was clear. In wobbly, defiant letters, it read, "Bridge beats Karen." The misspelling was somehow more potent than a perfectly lettered sign, a piece of folk art born of genuine frustration. It was a small, mocking flag of dissent planted in the heart of Brenda's perfectly regulated kingdom. Meanwhile, Judge Arthur Covington sat in his leather armchair in his study, the room dark except for a single lamp illuminating a silver-framed photograph on his desk. It was a black and white picture from 1937 showing his father and a team of men, grinning proudly on the newly completed bridge. He wasn't feeling rage. Rage was an imprecise emotion, a messy and often counterproductive impulse. What he felt was a deep, profound sadness, and beneath it, the cold, familiar hum of judicial duty. He had spent a lifetime upholding the law, a system of rules designed to protect society from the chaos of impulse and the tyranny of bullies. Brenda Van Patten was a bully of the highest order, a woman who believed the petty rules she wrote superseded the foundational laws of the nation. She had mistaken his quiet nature for weakness, his civility for cowardice. He had given her a clear, lawful warning, and she had spat on it. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a teachable moment about the bedrock principles of law and order. And he, by a strange twist of fate, was uniquely positioned to be the teacher. His sadness was for the bridge. His resolve was for the law itself. The first tremor of the earthquake arrived 2 days later, not at the judge's house, but at the HOA clubhouse. A dark blue Ford sedan with government plates, a vehicle that looked as out of place as a warship in a swimming pool. Pulled silently into the parking lot, 2 people stepped out. One was a sharp, impeccably dressed woman in her early 40s who introduced herself as Special Agent Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The other was a stern, weather-beaten man in a crisp Army Corps of Engineers polo shirt, who introduced himself as Regional Director Harris. They found Brenda in her office, a small room decorated with laminated copies of the HOA's covenants. She greeted them with the condescending air she reserved for contractors and inspectors. "Good morning," she said briskly, not looking up from her paperwork. "If you're here about the pool permits, you'll need to make an appointment." "We're not here about the pool, Ms. Van Patten," Special Agent Miller said, her voice flat and professional. She placed her credentials on the desk. "We're here to inform you that you and the Willows at Miller's Creek HOA are the subjects of an active federal investigation." Brenda stared at the FBI credentials, her smug expression faltering. "A federal? What for what?" "For starters, the willful destruction of a structure listed on the National Register of Historic Places, a violation of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1906, Agent Miller stated. As if reading from a charge sheet, Director Harris stepped forward. "And the illegal discharge of refuse in this case, wood, creosote-treated timber, and metal fixtures into a federally protected navigable waterway, a violation of the Clean Water Act, Section 404. We've already taken samples from the creekbed. My team will be here this afternoon to begin a full environmental impact assessment. The cleanup and remediation costs will be significant." Brenda's face had gone from pink to a pale, mottled white. "Navigable waterway, it's a creek. And it was a private bridge on private property. Miller's Creek is a tributary to the Catawba River, which makes it a water of the United States and under federal jurisdiction," Director Harris said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "And the bridge's federal historic status supersedes any local bylaws or property designations. You were informed of this, in writing, were you not?" That was just some letter from the old man who lives there," she stammered, her voice losing its confidence. "He was just trying to scare me." Special Agent Miller leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Brenda's. "The old man who lives there, Ms. Van Patten, is the Honorable Arthur Covington, retired senior judge of the U.S. District Court. The letter he sent you wasn't a scare tactic. It was a legal notification, one which you ignored. That elevates this from a simple violation to a knowing and willful one, which carries significantly higher penalties, including potential felony charges and incarceration." The room fell silent. The Honorable Arthur Covington, a federal judge. The words hung in the air. Zhong Ru Pen Shi. Brenda felt the floor drop out from under her. Every interaction, every sneer, every dismissive comment she had made to the quiet, Silver-haired man replayed in her mind, now cast in a terrifying new light. She hadn't been poking a harmless retiree. She had been taunting a lion, completely oblivious to its claws and teeth. We'll need copies of all HOA board meeting minutes for the past 6 months. Agent Miller continued, her voice pulling Brenda from her horrified trance. All financial records, all correspondence related to this matter, including the newsletter you sent out 2 days ago. A federal grand jury will be convened, and you and your board members will be subpoenaed to testify. I'd advise you to retain legal counsel, a very, very good one. Agent Miller used the exact words Gregory Abernathy had used on Amelia Thorne in the previous story, but coming from her. They were not a taunt. They were a professional courtesy, a warning that the full weight of the United States government was about to fall on their small, insulated world, and that she was standing at ground zero. The arrival of federal agents at the Willows Clubhouse was the legal equivalent of a tactical strike. The news ripped through the 200 homes of the community with the speed and devastation of a wildfire. The Willows Weekly newsletter, once a mundane chronicle of lawn care tips and potluck announcements, was replaced by a frantic storm of emails and panicked phone calls. The abstract concept of the HOA's power had suddenly collided with the terrifying, concrete reality of the FBI and the federal government. Brenda Van Patten locked herself in her home. Her fortress of self-righteousness had been shattered, the walls breached by a truth she could not comprehend. A federal judge. She replayed the words in her mind, each repetition a fresh wave of nausea. She remembered his calm, almost pitying eyes as she had screamed at him, his quiet dignity as she had mocked his love letter. She had seen him as an obstacle, an old man standing in the way of her perfect, taupe-colored vision of the world. She had never once considered that he might be the embodiment of a power so far beyond her own that it operated on a different plane of existence. The power she wielded was derived from a binder of rules about fence heights. The power he represented had built prisons and dismantled corporations. The first casualty of the new reality was the HOA board. Brenda called an emergency meeting, but it was not a gathering of allies, it was a mutiny. They met in the clubhouse, the scene of their former triumphs now feeling like a defendant's waiting room. The board members, a car salesman, a retired dental hygienist, and a real estate agent looked at Brenda not with respect, but with raw, accusatory terror. A federal investigation. The car salesman, a man named Bill, sputtered, waving a copy of the FBI's notice. Brenda, you told us this was a simple compliance issue. You told us he had no legal standing. How was they supposed to know who he was? Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking. Her usual commanding tone had been replaced by a shrill, defensive panic. He just looked like some old man. He should have told us. He did tell us. Brenda, the dental hygienist. Susan cried out, her face pale. He sent that registered letter, the one you read aloud to us and laughed about. You called it legal mumbo-jumbo. Our lawyer just reviewed it. It wasn't mumbo-jumbo. It was a precise, clear warning of exactly what is happening right now. The HOA's lawyer, a local attorney more accustomed to handling house closings than federal indictments, had been blunt. You are all in catastrophic trouble, he had told them over the phone, his voice tight with his own fear. You ignored a direct, formal notification of federal protected status. You proceeded with the demolition anyway. That's a textbook, willful violation. And the newsletter, Brenda, the newsletter you sent out boasting about it, that's what a prosecutor would call a written confession. I am not equipped to handle this. You need a team of criminal defense attorneys, and you need them yesterday. The board turned on Brenda with the ferocity of a pack of wolves. They voted, in a span of 5 minutes, to remove her as president. They passed a motion to issue a public apology to Judge Covington. They drafted a letter to the U.S. Attorney's Office, claiming they had acted solely on the erroneous and aggressive legal assurances of their now deposed leader. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to sever their own limbs to save the body, leaving Brenda as the sole sacrificial offering on the altar of federal justice. But the federal government was not interested in just one sacrifice. The wheels of a federal investigation, once set in motion, are slow, methodical, and crushing. The subpoenas arrived the following week, delivered by a stern-faced U.S. Marshal. Brenda Van Patten and every member of her former board were summoned to testify before a federal grand jury. Judge Arthur Covington, meanwhile, remained in his quiet stone house, an island of calm in the storm he had unleashed. He did not participate in the investigation. He was the victim, the primary witness. He had presented the facts to the proper authorities, and now he was letting the system he had served his entire life do its work. His former clerk, Catherine, now a rising star in the U.S. Attorney's Office, kept him apprised. "They're turning on each other. Judge," she told him over the phone. "Van Patten is blaming the board for not reining her in. The board is blaming her for misleading them. Their depositions are a masterclass in circular finger-pointing. It's tragic, in a way." "Tragedy, Catherine, often begins with arrogance," the judge replied calmly. "Has the Army Corps finished their assessment?" "They have," Catherine said, a grim note in her voice. "The news isn't good for the HOA. The heart pine timbers of the bridge were treated with an old form of creosote that is now a banned substance under EPA regulations. Its introduction into the creek has resulted in a registered environmental contamination event. The mandated cleanup will involve dredging a significant portion of the creek bed and replacing the topsoil on the banks. The preliminary cost estimate is north of $2 million. Judge Covington closed his eyes. The financial ruin of the HOA was now a certainty. The money they would have to pay in federal fines for the historic preservation violation, combined with the astronomical cost of the environmental cleanup, would bankrupt the association several times over. The residents of the Willows, who had paid their dues and trusted their leadership, were about to face a tidal wave of special assessments that would likely result in a slew of foreclosures and plummeting property values. Brenda's quest to protect property values had achieved the exact opposite with an irony so profound it was almost poetic. "And the grand jury," the judge asked. "They're leaning toward a multi-count indictment," Catherine confirmed. "Conspiracy to violate federal law, destruction of historic property, and violations of the Clean Water Act. They're looking at both the HOA as a corporate entity and the board members as individuals. Van Patten is likely facing felony charges. The others might get off with misdemeanors if they cooperate fully. But no one is walking away unscathed. The day of the grand jury testimony was a grim parade of suburbanites forced to confront the consequences of their petty kingdom's hubris, one by one. The former board members entered the solemn, wood-paneled room, their faces ashen. They told their story, painting Brenda as a rogue dictator who had bullied them into submission. Then it was Brenda's turn. She had lost weight. Her vibrant clothes had been replaced by a somber gray suit. Her face, once a mask of defiant certainty, was now pinched with fear. She sat at the witness table, the formidable power of the United States government arrayed before her in the form of a dozen impassive jurors and a relentless assistant U.S. attorney. Her testimony was a disaster. Under the prosecutor's calm, surgical questioning, her story fell apart. She tried to claim she didn't understand the letter. The prosecutor produced her college transcripts, showing a degree in business administration. She tried to claim the bridge was a safety hazard. The prosecutor produced a county inspection report from a year prior, requested by the judge, which declared the bridge structurally sound and exceptionally well-maintained. The final nail in her coffin came when the prosecutor projected her Victory for Compliance newsletter onto a large screen for the jury to see. "Miss Van Patten," the prosecutor asked, his voice soft, "these are your words. Are they not dilapidated and unapproved structure, long neglected eyesore? Is that how you would describe a federally protected historic landmark that you had been formally warned not to touch?" Brenda stared at her own triumphant words, now looking like a suicide note. She crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted, in a broken whisper, that she had been angry, that she felt the judge was looking down on them, that she had wanted to show him that the HOA's rules mattered more. It was a confession born not of remorse, but of wounded pride. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered, including several residents from the Willows. Among them was the person who had painted the Bridge Bates Carrion sign. As Brenda exited the building, a pariah abandoned by her lawyers and her community, she saw Judge Covington standing across the street, speaking quietly with his former clerk. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the federal courthouse, the great stone edifice of the law he had served. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't celebrating a victory. He simply looked sad, like a man who had been forced to perform a necessary but unpleasant duty. He had taken no joy in her destruction, only a grim satisfaction in the affirmation that the law was, in the end, supreme. Brenda finally understood. This was never a personal battle between her and the old man. It was a battle between her own ego and the entire weight of the United States legal system. And it was a battle she was never, ever going to win. The indictment came down like a guillotine, swift and final. The federal grand jury, after weighing the mountain of evidence, returned a true bill against both the Willows at Millers Creek HOA as a corporate entity and against Brenda Van Patten personally. The HOA was indicted on multiple counts, including violations of the National Historic Preservation Act and the Clean Water Act. The fines and mandated remediation costs were so colossal that they effectively served as a death warrant for the association. It was an insolvent entity, a ghost corporation haunted by the debts of its own arrogance. But for Brenda Van Patten, the consequences were far more personal and devastating. The grand jury indicted her on felony charges of conspiracy to commit a federal crime and willful destruction of historic property. The other board members, having thrown themselves at the mercy of the U.S. Attorney's Office and given testimony against their former leader, escaped with misdemeanor charges and heavy fines, their cooperation earning them a reprieve from prison time. Brenda, the architect of the scheme, was left to face the full fury of the federal government alone. The trial itself was a foregone conclusion, a legal autopsy more than a contest. It was held in the very courthouse where Judge Covington had presided for over 2 decades, though he was not present. His legacy and the unassailable authority of the law he represented filled the room. The assistant U.S. attorney methodically presented the case. She showed the jury the photographs of the beautiful, century-old bridge before its destruction. She played the audio recordings of Brenda's rantings. She presented the judge's polite, clear, registered letter of warning, followed by Brenda's boastful victory for compliance newsletter. Brenda's defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender, outmatched and overwhelmed, could offer little resistance. His client had already confessed on the stand during the grand jury hearing. Her only defense was a plea for mercy based on her profound ignorance of the law she had broken. But ignorance, as every first-year law student knows, is no defense. The jury, comprised of ordinary citizens who understood the simple difference between right and wrong, between pride and principle, deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was read in a courtroom thick with a tense, somber silence. On the charge of conspiracy to commit a federal crime, we, the jury, find the defendant, Brenda Van Patten, guilty. The forewoman's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. On the charge of willful destruction of property on the National Register of Historic Places, we, the jury, find the defendant, Brenda Van Patten, guilty. Brenda sat motionless at the defendant's table, her face a pale, slack mask. The words seemed to pass through her. Incomprehensible sounds from a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her small war, born of a petty dispute over wood stain, had ended here, in a federal courtroom, with the word guilty echoing in the silent, unforgiving air. The sentencing was scheduled for a month later. In that intervening time, the Willows at Millers Creek HOA ceased to exist, faced with crippling federal fines and an environmental cleanup bill that dwarfed their entire annual budget. The association declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The court-appointed trustee began the process of liquidating its assets. The clubhouse was sold, The pool was drained and covered. The tennis courts were locked, weeds beginning to sprout through cracks in the asphalt. The manicured entrances fell into disrepair. The very name The Willows became a mark of shame, a synonym for financial ruin and spectacular mismanagement. Property values, which Brenda had sought to protect with such tyrannical zeal, plummeted by 30%. Residents who could afford to sell did so at a significant loss, fleeing the blighted community. The kingdom Brenda had ruled was now a wasteland, a monument to her folly. On the day of her sentencing, Brenda Van Patten stood before a new judge, a woman half her age with sharp, intelligent eyes that betrayed no sympathy. She read a prepared statement, her voice a reedy, trembling whisper. She spoke of her dedication to her community, her desire to maintain standards. She apologized for her misunderstanding of the law. The judge listened patiently, her face impassive. When Brenda had finished, the judge leaned forward, peering down from the bench. "Miss Van Patten," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. This case was never about a misunderstanding. The evidence is overwhelming that you were given a clear, direct, and lawful warning by an expert in the field. You chose to ignore that warning. You chose to place the petty bylaws of your neighborhood association above the laws of the United States of America. The judge paused, her gaze hardening. This was not about compliance. This was about power. You believed your power as an HOA president was absolute. You sought to make an example of a man you perceived to be weak, a quiet resident who would not bow to your authority. But you, Mr. Van Patten, were the one who was profoundly mistaken. You mistook civility for weakness. You mistook wisdom for passivity. You picked a fight with the one man who had dedicated his entire life to the very laws you so flagrantly disregarded. It is a tragic and profound irony that in your quest to enforce your small rules, you broke some of our nation's most important ones. On the destruction of a historic landmark is not a trivial matter. The judge continued, it is an attack on our shared heritage, an erasure of our collective memory. The law takes such acts very seriously, especially when they are committed with such willful arrogance. Therefore, it is the sentence of this court that you, Brenda Van Patten, shall pay a fine of $250,000. Furthermore, you are sentenced to a term of 18 months in a federal correctional facility. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. 18 months. Prison. For a bridge. Brenda's knees buckled. She had expected a fine. Probation. Community service. The reality of incarceration. Of a life reduced to a cell and a number. Crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. The U.S. Marshals moved forward and gently took her by the arms as she began to sob, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her reign as the Queen of the Willows had ended with a prison sentence. Judge Arthur Covington was not in the courtroom. He was at home. That morning, a different kind of construction crew had arrived on his property. They were not wielding chainsaws. They were master craftsmen, specialists in historic restoration, hired by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and funded by a combination of federal grants and the fines levied against the HOA. They had brought with them salvaged heart pine timbers, sourced from a pre-war barn in Virginia, wood of the same age and character as the original. They had the original blueprints his father had drawn in 1936, which Judge Covington had kept safe for all these years. He stood on his lawn, a cup of coffee in his hand, and watched as they began the slow, careful work of bringing his bridge back to life. A young carpenter, seeing the judge watching, walked over. "It was a beautiful piece of work, sir," he said, nodding toward the old stone footings. "A shame what happened to it." "Yes, it was," the judge said quietly. "But it's being put right. That's what matters." He looked past the construction, across the creek to the blighted, wilting neighborhood on the other side. The Bridge Beats Karen sign was gone, but its sentiment lingered. He felt no triumph, no pleasure in Brenda's fate or the community's collapse. He only felt a deep, abiding sense of order restored. The law, like a great river, had been temporarily obstructed by a foolishly built dam of human ego. But the river was patient. The river was powerful. And in the end, the river always wins. He turned his back on the ruins of Brenda's kingdom and focused on the work at hand. He watched as the first new timber was carefully lowered into place, a new beginning rising from the wreckage of the old. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air. But this time, it was not the sound of destruction. It was the sound of rebuilding. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of a good man, a quiet man, finally getting his bridge back. The world felt a little more balanced, a little more right, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Judge Arthur Covington allowed himself a small, peaceful smile. The 18 months Brenda Van Patten spent at Alderson Federal Prison Camp in West Virginia did not humble her. They distilled her bitterness into a hard, dense, impermanent core. The woman who had ruled a suburban kingdom with an iron fist found herself in a world stripped of all context and status. Here, she was not President Van Patten. She was inmate number 78341-058. Her vibrant designer coats were replaced by a drab khaki uniform that smelled faintly of industrial soap and regret. Her authority was reduced to waiting in line for watery coffee and addressing guards as ma'am. Her initial weeks were spent in a state of furious disbelief. She wrote long, rambling letters to anyone who would listen, her estranged sister. A handful of former acquaintances proclaiming her innocence. She was the victim. She insisted. A victim of a vengeful old man, of an overzealous government, of a disloyal board who had betrayed her. She had been trying to protect property values, a civic duty, and had been punished as if she were a common criminal. The letters, filled with exclamation points and self-pity, mostly went unanswered. The other inmates, a mix of tax evaders, low-level drug offenders, and embezzlers, gave her a wide berth. They recognized her type instantly, the suburban queen bee, a woman whose power had existed only within a fragile, artificial ecosystem. In the stark meritocracy of prison, where resilience and authenticity were the only currencies that mattered. Brenda was bankrupt. Her stories of HOA violations and taupe color palettes were met with blank stares or derisive laughter. She had no new kingdom to build here, no rules to enforce, no one to impress. She was simply, terrifyingly, alone with the consequences of her own actions. She stopped writing letters. She grew silent, her face settling into a permanent mask of sour resentment. The world, she decided, was an unjust place. The law was a weapon used by the powerful to crush the well-intentioned. It never occurred to her that she had been the one attempting to wield it as such, and had simply, spectacularly, failed. Upon her release, a pale and gaunter version of her former self, she discovered the true extent of her annihilation. Her home in the Willows had been sold in foreclosure to cover the massive federal fine. Her name was now synonymous with disgrace in the local community. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Her car had been repossessed. The small inheritance she had once held was gone, devoured by legal fees. One crisp autumn day, months after her release, she found herself working a cash register at a gas station on a highway several towns over. It was anonymous, humiliating work. A luxury SUV pulled up to the pump, and a woman stepped out. Brenda recognized her instantly. It was Susan, the former dental hygienist from her HOA board. Susan did not recognize her. Brenda's face was harsher, her hair limp and uncolored, her eyes holding a flat, defeated emptiness. As Susan paid for her gas and coffee, she spoke to the man with her. "It's amazing how much better things are now," she said. "The new neighborhood co-op is working. We all chip in. Everyone has a say. It's quieter, more respectful." Brenda handed back the credit card, her hand trembling slightly. After Susan left, she stared out the window, in the direction of the community she had once ruled. She could picture the Gwaja's house and the space where the bridge used to be. She imagined it was still a ruin, a testament to her brief, fiery reign. The thought gave her a small, bitter comfort. She had lost, yes, but she had left a permanent scar. She was wrong. While Brenda was learning the harsh calculus of prison life, the community of the Willows was undergoing its own painful rebirth. The bankruptcy of the HOA had been a cataclysm. The beautiful landscaping grew wild. The pool cover collected a permanent film of green slime. The for sale signs multiplied like weeds. The community had become a legal no man's land, an unincorporated island of suburban decay. Their salvation began not with a leader, but with a problem. The private company that handled their trash collection, no longer being paid by a central HOA, stopped service for a week. Garbage cans overflowed at the end of every driveway. The stench of their collective failure hung in the air. It was Susan who finally broke the paralysis. She didn't call a meeting or declare herself a president. She simply printed out a flyer on her home computer. It read, "I don't know about you, but I'm tired of the garbage. I've spoken to the collection company. If we can pool our money, they'll resume service. There's a box on my porch. If you want your trash picked up, please put a check for $40 in it by Friday." It was a small, desperate act, but it was a start. Over half the residents contributed. On Saturday morning, the blessed, rumbling sound of the garbage truck returned. It was the first hopeful sound the neighborhood had heard in over a year. From that small victory, a new entity grew. It was not called an HOA. It was the Millers Creek Community Cooperative. There was no board of directors, only volunteer coordinators for different tasks: landscaping, road maintenance, neighborhood watch. They held meetings in backyards, not a clubhouse. Their budget was transparent, posted on a simple website for all to see. The dues were a fraction of what they had been, covering only the absolute necessities. They were forced to learn the difference between community, a shared set of responsibilities, and a lifestyle brand they paid someone else to maintain. The journey was arduous. The special assessment to pay for their portion of the federal environmental cleanup was a bitter pill, forcing several more families into foreclosure, but slowly, painstakingly, they began to knit their shattered community back together. They organized workdays to clear the overgrown common areas. A group of dads who knew something about pool maintenance got the filter running again. They were no longer subjects of a petty tyrant. They were citizens, forced into a messy, imperfect, but genuine form of self-governance. About a year into this process, Susan gathered her courage and walked down the road to the stone house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The bridge was nearly complete. Master craftsmen were oiling the new handrails, the scent of cedar and linseed oil hanging in the air. The structure was an exact replica of the original, a stunning piece of rustic architecture that seemed to radiate a quiet, timeless integrity. Judge Covington was on his lawn, speaking with the foreman. He saw Susan approach and dismissed the carpenter with a polite nod. "Susan," he said, his voice calm and welcoming. There was no trace of accusation in it. "Judge Covington," she began, her own voice trembling. On behalf of the residents, the ones who are left, I wanted to apologize, deeply, for what happened. We were weak. We let Brenda bully us, and we were silent when we should have spoken up. We are all so terribly sorry for what was done to you and to your family's bridge." The judge listened, his expression thoughtful. He looked at the nearly finished bridge, then back at her. "Thank you, Susan. That means a great deal." He paused, choosing his words with judicial care. The law is a blunt instrument. Sometimes, in correcting a great wrong, it causes collateral damage. I took no pleasure in the hardship this community has faced. My fight was never with my neighbors. It was with the abuse of power. It was with the idea that rules written for a neighborhood could supersede the rule of law that protects a nation. He gestured for her to walk with him toward the bridge. A homeowners association, when properly managed, can be a useful tool. It can maintain common goods and protect shared investments. But when it becomes a vehicle for the ego of one person, when it forgets that its power is granted by the very people it serves, it becomes a sickness. Your community is healing from that sickness. The process is painful. I know, but perhaps you will emerge stronger for it, with a better understanding of what it truly means to be a community. They stood at the foot of the new bridge. It was perfect. The heart pine timbers glowed with a warm, amber light. It looked as if it had always been there. It's beautiful, Susan whispered. It is, the judge agreed. My father would be pleased. He believed a bridge wasn't just about crossing from one side to another. He said it was about connection, a promise that two separate places can be joined. A few weeks later, on a quiet Saturday morning, the work was finished. The craftsmen packed up their tools and left. There was no ribbon cutting, no ceremony. That wasn't the judge's way. He simply walked out of his stone house, down the lawn, and stepped onto the bridge. He ran his hand along the smooth, sturdy railing. He breathed in the scent of the wood and the creek. He walked slowly across to the other side, his feet making a solid, reassuring sound on the planks. He stood there for a long time, looking back at his home. He had his connection back. He had his peace. The law had been tested, and it had held. Justice, however painful and costly, had been done. He turned and walked back across, returning to the quiet sanctuary of his property. A man at home in a world where order had been restored. One timber at a time, the weight of what had been lost had been lifted, replaced by the solid, enduring weight of the bridge itself. In the end, it was never just about a bridge. It was a lesson in the rule of law, a reminder that arrogance and ignorance are no defense against true power. The HOA picked a fight with the one man they couldn't bully. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story of epic justice, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below.